I want to thank all of you for joining this important conversation today. We just had a session with Representative Ro Khanna, Representative Alan Lowenthal, and Governor Jerry Brown. And there were some very interesting, thought-provoking ideas for how we move to improve US-Russian relations. I want to thank just Ro Khanna for his leadership. As you may know, he's really been a model of a foreign policy of restraint, of realism, of diplomacy. He recently introduced, if you didn't see it, a piece of legislation called Investing in Vaccines Before Missiles, and that would be ICBMs. I think many of you are here today very deeply troubled by the risk of accidental nuclear conflict or an attack, greater, more dangerous today than at any time since the end of the first Cold War. Who could not be deeply alarmed by the recent negative exchanges between leaders of the United States, Russia, and China? Russia and the United States linked. More than 90% of the world's nuclear warheads are in their arsenals. It seems to me we'll talk today about the importance of negotiation, of diplomacy, of talking, of sobriety. Joe Cirincione, who's with us, noted something interesting, which is the disconnect, it seems, between President Biden's ambitious, almost Rooseveltian domestic policy and a kind of old, one might even say obsolete kind of foreign policy, which is not of the new thinking. But one could remind President Biden that he might go back to his recently stated commitment to assuring that, quote, diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy. My husband, Stephen Cohen, historian, longtime analyst of Mikhail Gorbachev's foreign policies, courageous reforms, and someone who feared the nuclear scourge, Steve cared deeply about improving US-Russian relations. Part of my work in these last months has been to reinvigorate, revive a group Steve relaunched in 2015, the American Committee for East-West Accord, now renamed, the American Committee for US-Russia Accord, ACURA. If you're interested, usrussiaaccord.com. Two of its members, Anatol Lieven and Cynthia Lazaroff, are with us today. Let me just make one point. I've long believed that Cold Wars are really lousy for progressives. They empower the worst forces on both sides, war parties, the military, industrial, congressional, media, think tank complex. Nationalist fervor rises. Diplomacy is sidelined or worse, criminalized. The space for dissent narrows or closes in both countries in this case. And having worked for 4 decades, as Cynthia has with Russian journalists, dissidents, feminists, human rights NGOs, I've seen close up how Cold War tensions have been used to suppress independent voices in Russia and the United States. So with so much needed to rebuild our own country, reinvestment in social justice, racial justice, economic equality, confronting the climate emergency, seems to me we don't need, nor can we afford endless wars and a kind of obsolete, costly replay of the Cold War. Today you'll hear from Governor Brown, who has long thought about these issues and now as chair of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists is actually immersed in these issues and has some very important ideas. And Joe Cirincione, formerly of Ploughshares, Cynthia Lazaroff, someone who's been very involved with citizen exchanges in nuclear issues, climate change, and Anatol Lieven, who is a deep thinker on Russia, US-Russian relations, on the history of it, and many other things. So I want to begin with Governor Brown, and I want to thank all of you for your commitment to this issue, which is, a tough one to drive forward in this time of so much pain, conflict, a time when the country's exhausted. But if not now, when? So Governor Brown.
Sure, just a few thoughts, I guess, by way of introduction. The conflict with Russia has been going on a long time, since the very beginning of the Soviet Union. And I think we have to see things in an historical context and also see the way things are today and all the different conflicts that we find in the Middle East and in Asia and all the rest. We're in a very dangerous time. We're in a dangerous time, not just because of all the faults and the misbehavior of everybody else. We are embedded in the modern world, we being America, and we have our own foibles and darkness and strange pathways. The fact that we had a president that got 47% of the vote, as strange as Mr. Trump, has to tell you something about the country. Tens of millions of people believe Trump won the election. It's incredible. And there are a lot of beliefs out there that are very dangerous to handle. So we're in a fraught period. It's one that I think all of us, and certainly the people in positions of high power, have to take a step back and reflect carefully on the situation where we are, the dangers. And we know that the world we're in is unusual because of the heightened danger, the danger of a nuclear blunder, as Bill Perry is talking about, the danger of bio threats from terrorism or from naturally occurring pandemics, as Sam Nunn and others at the Nuclear Threat Initiative have talked about. We know about the dangers of climate change, has been put forward by many people. And then, of course, we see some upcoming problems with artificial intelligence, the development of more space weapons, the growing population. Put all that together, and it's a time when national leaders are called to rise above 19th century thinking, or even Harry Truman-like thinking, or even what we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years. So with respect to Russia, there's so much focus on Putin and his misbehavior. There's very little focus on our own ills. I'm not going to mention the Iraq war or our help with people, what's going on in Yemen and all these other places. I'm just going to say that it's time for dialogue. We're not talking to the Russians at anywhere near the level that we used to. As governor of California, I participated in what was called the Fort Ross Dialogue with some Russian governors at Stanford University 5 years ago. And I was told by the Obama State Department, don't participate. This was not a good thing, that we're giving Russia some kind of recognition or validation. I participated anyway, but that attitude has grown. And instead of fear to talk, we have to talk without fear. I mean I mean the president, not just once, but often. And then the Secretary of Defense, the head of the CIA, the leaders of Congress, leaders of different aspects of the American leadership group. That is not occurring. We are not sewing the connective tissue between Russia and the United States. And we need to do that, because if we're ever going to minimize the danger of a nuclear blunder, a danger of other kinds of war, whether it be in the Ukraine or Syria or other places, we need to be talking a lot more, and talking in the sense of dialogue. And the key to dialogue is listening to the other. What is the Russian view? A lot of people say, well, you can't listen to Putin. He's a murderer and he's a thug. Other people would say that if Putin were to leave, we may get something more nationalistic. So, and also, I have to just say, and I hear, if I can invoke my co-religionist, St. Augustine, nation states are not works of goodness or perfection. We are, well, he called them a group organized brigands, I think, in the city of God. So if we would just approach the world in a way that we have our flaws, certainly if you look domestically, there are a lot of people who think we're profoundly flawed. So we ought to address Putin not as a different kind of being, but a very important person in the world with different points of view. I don't think we're listening. I don't know if Biden's listening. He looked into Putin's eyes and he saw no soul. Well, obviously that's a metaphor. You can't see the soul. I don't know what Joe thinks about the soul. I spent most of my life being trained about saving souls. In fact, I joined the Jesuits to do that. But that's not what we need in foreign policy. We need to talk about, do we need, does Russia need 5 new weapon systems? Do we need our current modernization program? Can we find a way forward in Ukraine and other places? And I think we can. I don't think the problems that we're facing are insurmountable. What is missing is dialogue at every level. And dialogue, there's a word now that I hear used in international things, empathy. Not like I want to feel your pain, but I want to understand your subjective view, because I have a subjective view, which I think is the objective view, but it is subjective. We know that scientifically. And what's the view of Mr. Putin? What's the view of the people surrounding him? We need to try to clarify the difference and find areas of common commonality. The common, that's what I call planetary realism. Yes, national interest. I know Anatol is talking a lot about nationalism, but there is something called planetary realism. We're on this planet. Big, smart people think we got a 1 in 6 chance of extinction or the irrecoverable destruction of civilization. That's the book, The Precipice. Well, he's not the only guy. So if that's only, a 1 in 100 or 1 in 500, that's enough to get our big people, Putin, Xi, and Biden and others and all their little underlings, to be talking to minimize these threats, as well as mobilizing our own country with all the problems we have. I'm sure we're going to hear from Anatol about immigration and the nation state and all the rest of it. Great. But at the same time, we got to talk, and we can't act like, Russia is a greater threat to our democracy than Fox News. I mean, Fox News has done 100 times more than the Russians have done to sow discord. And we have to call out what is the truth. So I'm not talking about being soft or being fuzzy-headed. I'm talking about truth, and truth as much as we can attain to as flawed human beings. So that's my point. I think the problems are not as great. They're not objectively as great. We can deal with the problems of the world. We can feed people. We can share technology. We can get the virus spread. But we got to, first of all, find out where we stand. And we only do that if we listen at the highest levels. And then we get to work on these big issues. And I think the big issues might tie us together as long as we're taking care of the big issues domestically and putting America back to work.
Governor Brown, thank you very much for speaking truth, for planetary realism, for giving us a sense of what we could do to address these times. Really appreciate, and I know that people on the call understand you've been involved with the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and trying to bring together climate and nuclear issues, which I think is part of our project moving forward. So thank you very much. I want to turn to Joe Cirincione for comment.
Sure, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be part of this panel. I expect to learn quite a lot from the real Russian experts on the panel. Let me just start off where exploring the theme that Governor Brown just laid out. What are the real threats? What are the real challenges? And as you mentioned, Katrina, I am struck by the disconnect between the Biden administration's very aggressive and rightly focused domestic policies and where they're spending their time, where they're spending their money, where they're spending their political capital. And that is on the issues of the pandemic, the economic recovery, the issue of climate change, of racial and gender justice, of income inequity, with truly transformative proposals for how to address these problems. But then you go over to the foreign policy agenda, and it seems out of whack with that. They seem to be continuing basically the Trump administration frame, although with better rhetoric and a slightly different emphasis. But basically the national security strategy forged about 3 years ago by the Trump administration that said that our current era is one that's characterized by great power conflict. So not climate change pandemics, not transnational threats, but great power conflict. This to me is an anachronistic and incorrect and dangerously incorrect frame, because it orients us towards a military conflict between the so-called self-declared great powers. So that's, and what does that mean? It has serious implications for where we then put our national security resources. And some of us were very encouraged by the article that then candidate Joe Biden wrote a year ago in Foreign Affairs, where he called for a foreign policy for the middle class, a foreign policy that would deliver tangible benefits for the American public. And I was encouraged when I saw him introduce his national security team in December. And Jake Sullivan, now National Security Advisor, said that Joe Biden had tasked them with reimagining national security, reimagining it to include these issues of climate change and racial justice and gender justice and income inequity. And yet we don't yet see that in the rhetoric. We have this Cold War overhang where, for example, Secretary of State Tony Blinken goes to NATO last week and lays out what he says are the military threats. And what does he mean by the military threats? He details this kind of quad of evil: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and that these represent threats to us both in conventional military, and then his second series of threats is that they represent sort of the new cyber threats, the new types of threats that are facing us in that field. And then only then does he then go and lump together climate change, pandemics, challenges to democracy as the third level threat. So you see, they haven't quite put all this together yet. They haven't synced up their domestic priorities with their national security priorities. And why is that? What explains that? To me, it's explained by the political factors and frankly, the influence of the defense contractors on our national security strategy. Politically, the president seems to believe that he has such a heavy lift domestically. He can't afford to lose any Democratic votes on his domestic packages. He has to get his nominees through various hawkish committees in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Armed Services Committee. And he wants to get a House reelected in 2 years, a Senate Democratic majority reelected in 2 years. So he's taken a traditional establishment Democrat view, which is that you stay strong on national defense in order to go progressive on domestic. So you sort of protect your right flank with strong rhetoric, a strong approach, high levels of military spending. So therefore, what does this mean? It translates into a military budget that he's not going to cut this year. He's going to keep it at the historically high levels of Donald Trump. We're spending more on the military, more on the Pentagon now than we spent during almost any year of the Cold War, save for the 2 years and after, save for the 2 years of the Iraq invasion. In other words, we're spending more on national security now than we did during the Vietnam War, during the Reagan buildup, during the Korean War, any war since World War II. And he's not going to adjust that down yet, I believe, for political reasons and for the influence of contractors. If he's going to do that, he would have to cut some major weapon systems, and he would generate a huge fight with contractors. So does that mean that we don't face military threats? Let me close with this. No, we do. Russia does represent a military threat to the United States, but mainly in the region. It is a regional military threat. Mm-hmm. The Ukraine, the Balkans, the Baltics, rather, they do represent a global challenge to us, particularly in the area of cyber warfare. This is a real concern. But as the governor just said, Fox News did much more damage than the Russian operations did. And the kind of threats that they represent to the world are actually these transnational threats, a climate risk. What happens if the Siberian permafrost melts and releases vast amounts of methane? Anatol, I'm getting into your area. I mean, that is a planetary mega crisis. And that requires us to cooperate with Russia on climate change, not challenge them. And so then you get down to the details of the military budget, the kind of challenges that Congress is going to face. And you look at what the military budget is proposing, and they're proposing a brand new ICBM, a $100 billion system that will cost $265 billion over its lifetime. How does that help us? What does that address? What challenge does that meet? That is not the threat we face from Russia. That is an anachronistic system, an outdated strategy. And we have to work as hard as we can to try to help the Biden administration reconcile its correct analysis of the domestic priorities we face with its outdated, obsolete national security strategy that it's mainly carrying forward for domestic political reasons. Let me stop there. I'm sorry if I went on a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. I'm going to turn to Cynthia. And I just want to, there's a question already, Marcia Hunt. Sharon Tennyson is on the board of Acura. So I just want you to know, there was a fan of Sharon's. Cynthia knows Sharon well. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, Katrina, for inviting me to be on the panel. I'm so honored to be here with you and my fellow panelists and everyone with us on Zoom today. I want to start by sharing my screen. So when the Cold War came to an end, I thought I could stop worrying about nuclear war. And all of that changed for me in 2017 when I made this film on US-Russia relations and interviewed top experts in the US and Russia, dozens of them on nuclear dangers. And everyone awakened me to today's staggering nuclear danger. The two people who had the greatest impact on me were former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and our former Secretary of Defense, William Perry. And Secretary Perry said to me that today, that we're at a greater risk of some kind of nuclear catastrophe than during the Cold War. And most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. And then he said, because we don't understand the dangers, we make no serious attempt to repair the hostility between the United States and Russia. And so that we're allowing ourselves to sleepwalk into a nuclear catastrophe. We must wake up. At that moment, I realized that I'd been sleepwalking since the end of the Cold War. When I came home here to Hawaii after those interviews, it was at the height of the fire and fury tensions between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. And just a few weeks later, I was one of over 1 million people across the Hawaiian Islands who all got this message on our cell phones: ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii, seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. After receiving confirmation from a journalist that our county government was telling us to take shelter, I spent the next 38 minutes trying to prepare my family to survive a nuclear attack. Where do you go? What do you take with you? Where are your loved ones? Can you get to them? How many minutes do you have? Who do you call to say goodbye? For me, it was my daughter in LA. As I was racing to shelter in a cave, I called her and said, Mackenzie, we've all gotten this message on our cell phones that we're going to be hit by a nuclear missile. And I just want you to know that I love you. And she said, Mom, I love you too. At that moment, time stopped for me. I didn't want to let her go. And I thought, will I ever see her again? I thought, is this one nuclear missile from North Korea? Or is this many nuclear missiles coming from Russia to us and many going back from us to them? Is this the beginning of the accidental war, the accidental nuclear war with Russia that Secretary Perry and the other experts I interviewed are so worried about? Is this the beginning of the end of life as we know it, of everything and everyone we know and love and cherish on this earth? This experience now lives inside of me. It's visceral, it's in my gut, and it's never going to go away until we eliminate the risk 100%. I have no illusions about the formidable obstacles in the way of achieving this, but we can start by reducing the risk of blundering into a nuclear war with Russia by accident, miscalculation, or mistake. So today, despite the deep differences and the high toxicity in US-Russia relations, it's an existential imperative that we act now to reduce this risk. Here are 3 things that worked during the Cold War that we can do right now. 1, and this echoes what Governor Brown said, restore and maintain a constant dialogue on nuclear issues that's insulated from our political differences like we did during the Cold War. Today, that dialogue is gone, and without communication, this increases the likelihood of escalation to nuclear use in a moment of crisis. It's omnicidal behavior to stop talking to your nuclear adversary. We fail to sustain a dialogue with Russia at our own peril. Number two, Presidents Biden and Putin should reaffirm the declaration made by President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. This went a long way during the Cold War to reassure the people of the two countries and the world that even though we had deep differences, we were committed to never fighting a nuclear war. Congress and the Russian parliament should reaffirm this declaration too. Three, re-engage with Russia, restore wide contacts, scientific, medical, educational, cultural, and environmental exchanges. As soon as this is possible after COVID, but we can start on Zoom. Expand people-to-people citizen diplomacy, track 2, track 1.5, and governmental diplomatic initiatives. These 3 steps would reduce tensions and lay the foundation for further nuclear risk reduction measures, like adopting a no first use policy, de-alerting our ICBMs, and as the 2 countries that possess over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, reducing our arsenals and ultimately fulfilling our obligation to end the arms race and achieve total disarmament as mandated by Article 6 of the NPT. It's really time for a bold reimagining of relations for the 21st century. In citizen diplomacy, we ask ourselves, what could be game-changing? What can open hearts? What can change minds? So we imagine massive student exchanges, 2-way homestay programs. Imagine indigenous peoples from Alaska and Siberia, members of the same tribe, gathering in the Bering Strait, in the place where the border between our 2 countries is less than 3 miles apart. Imagine the American and Russian people partnering in a moonshot moment to plant 1 trillion trees, which climate scientists say could be game-changing for the climate. It could reduce CO2 by 25%. Imagine that they're joined by people from China and the other nuclear armed states, by people from all over the world, demonstrating that we can all do something together to benefit the Earth and humanity. We have to start somewhere. These are the kinds of citizen diplomacy initiatives that we need today. In the 1980s, members of Congress and Soviet lawmakers held their first capital-to-capital dialogues by something we called a space bridge, which was linking them by satellite. These were broadcast on national television in both countries, witnessed by over 100 million people. Our lawmakers did not shy away from having the tough conversations necessary to back us away from the brink. Both sides aired their grievances about everything from human rights to nuclear security to regional conflicts, and they found common ground. The dangers are greater today, the stakes are higher, and my prayer is that our members of Congress start talking to their Russian counterparts once again to reduce the risk of a nuclear catastrophe. We can hold Russia accountable, stand strong where we disagree, reckon with our differences, and at the same time realized our shared interest to come together for peace, to eliminate the threat of nuclear war and address the existential threats of our time, the pandemic, climate change. Then here in the US, we can redirect the trillions we're spending on nuclear weapons and militarism into education, healthcare, climate justice, racial justice, and all of the issues that are so urgently calling for our attention. During the Cold War, we launched the first Soviet American mountain climbs, and as a demonstration of our capacity to cooperate, survive, and thrive together. And we used to say, like climbers tethered together on one rope, we can either all climb together to the summit or fall together into the abyss. And that's really the choice we have now in relations. We can either find a way to become partners to address the real security and existential threats of our time, or continue on this downward spiral. We absolutely cannot ignore the nuclear dimension of our relationship with Russia. We have to remember what's at stake. Our lives are at stake. Even if less than 1% of our nuclear arsenals are used, this would mean the end of civilization. Thank you.
Cynthia, thank you for reminding us what's at stake, and also for the very concrete, powerful ideas as to what people can do.
Thank you.
Because I think it's important to give people, citizens, a sense of what the power they have. And I thank you for speaking about what we can retrieve in our past, the citizen to citizen, the dialogue, the arms control, and moving forward. So thank you. And I want to turn, we have 2 members of the American Committee for US-Russian Accord, Cynthia and Anatol. And I believe we have two members of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Joe and Anatol. Anatol, thank you for joining us from Doha. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be with you, and thank you for inviting me, and I very much look forward to joining you in America shortly. I thought I'd take advantage of my advancing age, I won't speak for anybody else on the panel, and take up the challenge of Governor Brown to put things in a historical context and ask, I mean, how did we get here from the great hopes of 30 years ago or so when the Cold War ended? And I think it's, from that point of view, it's worth looking at a famous or infamous memo of 1992, written by Paul Wolfowitz and Scooter Libby, recommendation to the then Bush administration, Bush the father, very different man from Bush the son, about the future of US strategy. And what this memo said quite explicitly was the US is going to be not just the world hegemon, but the only hegemon, the dominant power in every region of the world. The only external influence of any other country is going to be that which is allowed to it by the United States. The US will have a dominant military presence in every part of the world, and the only legitimate interests of any other country in the world will be such interests as are said to be legitimate by the United States and implicitly are in accordance with US interests. Now, the interesting thing is, when that memo leaked to the New York Times, I think it was just about universally mocked and condemned. It was immediately disowned by the Bush administration, by the way. It was denounced as megalomaniac, absurd, you know, more of Wolfowitz's strange ideas. Now, what seems to me to have happened is that in the years that followed, this memo, the arguments of this memo became the standard operating procedure of all the following US administrations, Democrat and Republican, in effect. And if you start out with a program like that, there is essentially no possibility of really good or consensual relations with other major powers. I mean, except those who identify themselves completely with the United States. Actually, even India has defied the US repeatedly on this. And so it seems to me that the US has committed itself to a program which is bound to cause international hostility, you know, with other major powers who were never going to accept this, you know, this kind of US domination of them and of their external relations. But what happened in the process as well was that parts of the world which actually, let's tell the truth, still the great majority of American politicians, let alone people, could not find on a map, somehow were advanced through the media, through the blob, the foreign and security establishment, to become key, vital US interests. Think back 40 years. If you asked 1,000 Americans, all British, 10,000, 100,000, which country does Crimea belong to? They'd have said Russia. It's in Russia, isn't it? Maybe it's actually in China. I'm not sure, but I think it's in Russia. And so the Crimea ought to belong to Ukraine. That is a vital US security interest. Oh, and by the way, that implies that we're going to kick the Russians out of their naval base at Sevastopol. They would have recommended you go to a lunatic asylum. And yet, somehow, through creep, unexamined creep, the failure of people to stand up against this, not everybody, some people did, some very great people did, but somehow this megalomaniac agenda became accepted by the blob and sold to the US people, or rather not sold to the US people, because the US people were never really consulted about this. The US people have said again and again and again and again, concentrate on our domestic needs, and have been ignored, frankly. And so, you know, the US has found itself committed to these positions, which were never examined in terms of US interests or the interests of the world of international peace, of your international cooperation. So that's looking back and how we got here. But I also like to look forward. And I often say, you know, from the perspective of 100 and whatever it is, 7 years now, every historian agrees that the great powers in Europe that went to war in 1914 were crazy. In terms of their real interests, in terms of the interests of Europe, of the world, leave alone the ordinary people who died in the First World War, the elites who were destroyed, countries that were destroyed. They were mad. They got their interests completely wrong. Well, I'm absolutely convinced that if there are historians in 100 years' time, which there won't be, of course, if the warnings made by Cynthia and Joe, God forbid, are fulfilled, that they will look at us in the same way. Because under the effects of climate change in particular, of course, if there's a nuclear exchange, then, well, then the whole thing becomes frankly academic. But in view of what's, you know, what is threatening us with climate change, the risks of climate change, but frankly, the damage that we are bound to suffer now because of the damage that we've done to the environment already, they will look at the obsessions of our security elites with some of these issues, and they will say, those people must have been crazy, just crazy, deranged in their priorities. Because after all, they already knew. The scientists have been howling at us on climate change. Great and knowledgeable people have been howling at us about the threat of nuclear war. But somehow, our establishments, you know, which came out of the Cold War and never left it, frankly, you know, who are absolutely tied still to their old agendas, because their old agendas are tied to their old jobs, cannot escape from this, I think, or at least have not done so far, into truly new thinking. And of course, Joe made a very important point there, and this is something that I've seen again and again in the field of climate change. It's very easy to say climate change is a great threat, we must do something about it. But then, if in fact you do what so many people of the foreign and security establishment did, as soon as Biden appointed Kerry as his climate change czar, the articles came rushing in saying, of course, climate change is very important, but we must not allow this, you know, to obscure the other vitally important threats. And then, of course, depending on which expert it was Iran, or it was Russia, or it was China, almost likely it was all of them simultaneously. And guess what? Climate change suddenly recedes to the number 6 or 7 or 8 position in terms of the real, of the priorities of the Washington elite. And of course, spending priorities, because, as has already been said by several of the panelists, the present military configuration of the US in the world is extremely expensive, and it takes away money from, as a great American general and president said, President Eisenhower, it takes away money from schools, from hospitals, from the well-being of the American people, and of course, from action against climate change. But there's another thing here which I must say has struck me more and more, that not with China, I'm deeply afraid of the growing Cold War mentality with China, but with Russia, there's also an element of play acting about this. You know, we hear again and again from our military establishments that Russia is a conventional military threat. Now, if they really believed this, America would presumably be sending a whole army to Europe to resist a potential Russian attack. Nothing of the sort is happening. And of course, part of the reason is that we already decided in Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, we're not going to defend these places. We're not going to fight for them. And I'm not sure, frankly, that anyone actually believes that Russia is going to attack a NATO member. What would it gain, compared to the risks involved? And as for European countries, well, you know, my country, Britain, has a reputation for being, you know, one of the toughest of them with the highest military spending. The British government is a conservative government, by the way, is reducing the British army to a level where it could not put one division of troops in the field, not one division. Would it be doing that if it really believed that there was a threat of Russian invasion? No. I can't help thinking that there is a lot in this, as Joe said, of military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Main battle tanks, for example. Are we going to use them against Russia? No, we've proved that we aren't. Are we going to fight China on land? There isn't a military strategist in Washington who thinks that that is going to happen, or is that going to be a good idea? What are these main battle tanks there for? Well, look, on a good side, they're there to create American jobs. But this, it seems to me, is a dreadful problem with the US military spending, that it is in effect America's technological industrial plan, which cannot be called by that name in the presence of Republicans.
Yeah.
So other countries have, including China, have explicit plans to develop their industrial technology, to maintain their high technology. America has military spending, which is about the most wasteful, the most incompetent, the most misdirected way of doing that one could possibly imagine, compared, for example, to doing also what the Chinese are doing and really, really pursuing alternative energy, for example, electric cars, the whole transition to coping with climate change.
Anatol, forgive me. I just going to close out in a minute, but thank you.
That's really all I had to say.
Really? No. Well,
I have much more to say, but I won't say it now.
I don't know if we can take another 10 minutes. This may cut us off, but I wanted to thank you very much, Anatol. Military Keynesianism, sadly, the national industrial policy of the United States, as you described. I want to thank all of you for reminding us what is at stake and the peril. And if we had a minute, I wanted to just go one by one and ask what step would you give priority to at this moment in terms of reestablishing dialogue, diplomacy with Russia? And I'm reminded by one of our questions from John Evans that Congress, and this is a session devoted to Congress, has really been the locus of punitive anti-Russia sanctions and the Magnitsky Act and others, but the sanctions seem increasingly ineffectual. And I know you've written about that, Anatol. So just thinking about, it may be far too idealistic to imagine exchanges between the Russian Duma and Congress, but what steps concretely could people on this call take? And I just want to say a word that this, I hope, will be the beginning, because I think our media is too much one-hand clapping, to say the least, and at least a dialogue, an open-mindedness to different views about US-Russian relations, about the state of our national security, foreign policy, new thinking would be of value. And I ask those on the call to come to justforeignpolicy.org, which is playing a good role in Congress, to the American Committee for East-West, for US-Russia Accord, and to get alternative views at a minimum and this will be streamed. So I hope people will share this. We will be posting it. But Cynthia, let me begin with Governor Brown, who talked earlier about a humility agenda that you ran on in 1992. I'm going back to find that. You're muted, Governor, which is a very unusual state.
The humility agenda, actually, Ralph Nader gave me the idea, and it's not that good. The agenda itself is not any good,
Okay.
not that good. But the idea of humility as being
Yes.
something that everybody should consider. By the way, I do have to correct one thing. This is not about one hand clapping. What is the sound of one hand clapping? That is a Zen koan. If our leaders would only consider that, we'd be in much better condition.
Okay.
Anyway, what do we need to do?
Corrected.
Okay, talk. Let us talk to the Russians. And I'm telling you, even for me to have the Fort Ross dialogue, we have the New York Times getting on the phone with me for 1 hour and saying, how dare you talk to the Russians without mentioning Syria, the poisoning, the hurricane. And this idea that you can just explore your respective worldviews is right now heretical. So let's just take these baby steps. Get some congressional leaders.
Right.
We'll have our Fort Ross dialogue. I'm going to make it even more expansive than in years before. So I think let us take some humble first steps and forge ahead.
Good. Thank you. Joe?
The dialogue is absolutely important, but since this is a congressional office here audience, there were two things in the Pentagon budget that I think we should focus on: restricting, slowing down, limiting two weapon systems that are not needed for the national defense of the United States, but are enormously provocative, enormously destabilizing. And the first is the ICBM. Cynthia's mentioned this. This is a massive new modernization program, basically going to replace all land-based missiles in the United States with the systems that will last 50 years. It's enormously provocative, very dangerous, high risk of accidental launch for all the reasons Dr. Perry has outlined. Representative Ro Khanna is leading the charge in the House on this. Ed Markey's leading the charge in the Senate to cancel this program. Let's see what the Biden administration does. The second destabilizing program doesn't get as much attention anymore, but it's missile defense. It's this idea that we can build a national missile defense system, not defenses against regional short-range, medium-range missiles. No, a national shield, they call it, to protect the United States. This is extremely destabilizing also. Why? 2 years ago, Vladimir Putin introduced 5 new weapons that caused a lot of news. Why did he do that? They were all designed to circumvent a US missile defense system. In 2001, George W. Bush used the 9/11 crisis to get out of the ABM treaty. Putin says he warned Bush, don't do that. If you do that, we'll have to respond. It took a while for those weapons to develop, but Putin says, you wouldn't listen to us then, listen to us now. This is all about the military defense, offensive, defensive battle. Slow down the National Missile Defense Program, curtail it, slow down the ICBM program. Those are the two biggest things we could do to increase stability in the US-Russian
Thank
contest.
you. Cynthia?
I would have to say that the most important thing, I agree with Jerry, and Joe mentioned it also, Dr. Governor Brown, forgive me, that it's the dialogue, that we have to decriminalize talking to Russia. Right now, it's as Governor Brown mentioned, people are attacked. I know others who have been attacked. And so we have to find a way to create a safe space where it's people understand that our lives are at stake, that we have to have these conversations, even though we disagree, even though we, are loathe and abhor some of the authoritarian things being done. We have to not hold these existential conversations hostage to our political differences. So I would say restoring the dialogue and creating that context that's safe on both sides, because now the Russians are there. There's an anti-American sentiment there as well. So that kind of, we had that safe space in the Cold War. We have to find our way back there. It really is existential. And I think it's got to be bipartisan. I think it's got to be a range of people, maybe a kind of delegation that crosses different thought leaders, congressional people, artists, musicians on both sides. I think that, and then you bring in the citizen diplomacy element. And I would go back to that we have to, my Russian colleague, who's the head of the Peer Non-Proliferation Center, Vladimir Orlov, said when I interviewed him, we just need one success story. Let's find one place where we can work together to do something beneficial. And so I go back to the tree planting, which citizens can get involved in, or something related to addressing the pandemic. That's an exchange of information that really shows that we can actually do something positive together. We need that demonstration of cooperation.
Thank you, Cynthia. Before turning to Anatol, I just want to say the idea of decriminalizing diplomacy is so important. My husband, Steve, used to talk about the criminalization of diplomacy. And if anyone understood, and one reason he relaunched this committee, if anyone understood being attacked and stigmatized for unorthodox views and views which shouldn't be unorthodox, calling for a dialogue with Russia, it was Steve. So in that spirit, I wanted to revive this American Committee for US-Russia Accord. But Anatol, over to you.
Well, I mean, on democracy and human rights, I think that the United States should be consistent. However, I have a different view of consistency from most people who say that. I was talking to a US official the other day, and of course I raised the issue naturally of Saudi Arabia, the murder of Khashoggi, everything that goes on within Saudi Arabia, treatment of women. I raised the issue of Egypt, coup against an elected government, worst repression that has been for many decades and so forth. And he gave the standard reply. Look, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but you have to understand, we need to have good relations with these countries. This is in our interest. If we attack them, this, would have very negative repercussions for US diplomacy. But the point is, if we agree, we may not, but if we agree that it is important to US interests to talk with Russia and seek agreement on certain issues, the same thing applies. We maintain our principles, but if we also have interests involved and global interests, not just ours, we cannot afford to beat people over the head, even if, as the governor said, we were ourselves innocent in that regard. As a Catholic by origin myself, I also remember the words of Church, that we are all sinners and black sinners. And certainly if you look at the US and Russian records in the Middle East, it will be hard to say which has been worse, or at least, I think America has been worse in recent years, over the past 20 years. And as for how to approach relations with Russia, well, I would begin with the issues where, in fact, we agree. One of them is combating ISIS in the Middle East, and Islamist terrorism, from which Russia has suffered just as badly as the United States, by the way. Another is the future of Afghanistan. Cut through the propaganda, and actually America and Russia are pretty much on the same page. There has to be a political settlement involving the Taliban, but we don't want the Taliban simply to take over the country. Let's talk about that. Russia is going to be engaged in Afghanistan long after the US has gone home. And Iran. Russia supported the Iran deal, maybe not as soon as it should, maybe not as strongly as it should, but it did support it in the end and it stuck with it. America walked away. Okay, so let's talk to Russia about how we can best come back to the nuclear deal with Iran. So that's how I would begin. Look at the issues on which one can agree. And I would say, although the Russians are really dragging their feet on climate change action, like many other countries, including the US, alas, up to the Biden administration, it's still an issue on which in principle now we agree, and as Joe said, on which we can start to talk.
Thank you very much, all of you, for this really thought-provoking, important discussion. May it be the beginning, and may we take steps to begin what we believe in, which is improving not only US-Russian relations, but a different mindset toward the world. And I think we did cover the world. Thank you, Anatol, for bringing us to an issue which is looming, Afghanistan, and of course, the situation in the Middle East and the Iran nuclear deal. To be continued, and thank Just Foreign Policy, and thank all of you for taking time to speak to people who care. From care comes change, and onward.